Hello and welcome to my channel. Here I tell interesting stories. Don't forget to subscribe.
Imagine a city more than 3,000 years old. Streets of white stone, scorched by the day's relentless sun, now slowly cooling in the night air. The city smells of dust, incense, and something ancient, something for which no modern language has a word. This is Jerusalem. The year is 1118 AD. The Crusaders seized the city 19 years ago. The streets once walked by Christ are now patrolled by knights in iron armor. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre stands open to pilgrims from across Europe, men and women who walk thousands of miles on foot just to touch a sacred stone. They sold their homes, said goodbye to their families, crossed seas and mountains, all for a single moment to fall to their knees in the place where by their faith God himself died and rose again. But the roads to Jerusalem were dangerous, terribly dangerous. Bandits hid in olive groves, ambushes waited on mountain passes. Pilgrims were found afterwards, robbed, murdered, left beneath the merciless sun of the Holy Land. No protection, no escort, nothing but faith and the hope that fortune might be kind. And it was into this very city, in this very year, that 9 men arrived, 9 knights. Their names meant nothing to anyone in 1118. No one greeted them with ceremony. They brought no army, no gold. They arrived nearly empty-handed, with a single request for the King of Jerusalem. Give us a place to live. We will protect the pilgrims. A simple request, a modest mission. Or so it seemed. What if these 9 knights, dusty, penniless, nameless, set in motion a chain of events that changed the entire Western world? What if they stood at the very origin of the modern banking system? Gothic architecture, secret societies, and possibly held something in their hands so dangerous that it got them destroyed 2 centuries later. And the strangest thing of all, no one to this day knows exactly how any of it happened. Historians argue. The church stays silent, and in the stones of ancient cathedrals, if you know where to look, the clues are still there, waiting to be read. Tonight we begin to unravel this mystery, slowly, layer by layer, like an archaeologist brushing dust from a relic, carefully so as not to destroy what lies beneath. In this episode, you will discover who the 9 knights really were and why they accepted no new members into their order for 9 full years. What historians and legends believe they were searching for beneath the Temple Mount. How a small military brotherhood became wealthier than most European kings within 2 decades. What secret rituals took place behind the closed doors of their castles at night. And why on Friday the 13th of October 1307, the King of France did something whose echo has never stopped ringing. But first we must go back to the beginning, to the dust of Jerusalem, to the year 1118, to 9 knights standing at the gates of a palace. The story begins. Let us begin with what we know for certain. The year is 1118. A French knight named Hugues de Payens comes before the King of Jerusalem with an idea that, on the surface, seems almost naive. He wants to create a brotherhood, a small group of knights who will take monastic vows and dedicate themselves to a single purpose: protecting Christian pilgrims on the roads of the Holy Land. Not an army, not a political force, simply armed monks on dangerous roads. Hugues de Payens was a nobleman from Champagne, one of the wealthiest regions of France. He was well past 40, practically an old man by the standards of his time. He had fought in the Crusades, had seen war from the inside and had apparently concluded that military force alone could never hold the Holy Land. Something else was needed, something permanent. With him came 8 men. Most of their names survive in the chronicles: Godfrey de Saint-Omer, André de Montbard, uncle of the future Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, Payen de Montdidier, Archambault de Saint-Amand, and several others whose names history has only partially preserved. All of them were French nobility. All were veterans of the Crusades. All were men who had something to lose and came anyway. King Baldwin II received them warmly. He understood the value of such a brotherhood. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was a small, vulnerable state surrounded by hostile lands, and any additional military strength was a gift. But what he offered them as a residence was unexpected. The southern wing of the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount. The Crusaders called this complex the Templum Solomonis, the Temple of Solomon, a vast, magnificent structure at the summit of a hill which, in Jewish tradition, is considered the navel of the earth, the place where Abraham nearly sacrificed his son, where the legendary First Temple once stood. The knights were given quarters directly beneath its great dome, and from this, their name, the Templars, the Knights of the Temple, Pauperes Commilitones, Christi Templic Salomonici, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and the Temple of Solomon. Their official mission was clear: patrol the roads from the Mediterranean coast to Jerusalem, protect pilgrims, destroy bandits. Everything logical, everything understandable. And right here, the first mystery begins. For 9 years, the order accepted almost no new members. 9 years. Think about that number carefully. 9 nights, patrolling mountain roads, ravines, forest trails across hundreds of miles of hostile terrain. 9 years with no growth, no recruitment, no expansion. The chronicler Fulcher of Chartres mentions them only in passing, almost indifferently. The historian William of Tyre, writing several decades later, was frankly puzzled. He noted that the order remained impossibly small for an organization with such responsibilities for an inexplicably long time. So what were these 9 men actually doing all those years? The official answer is that they patrolled the roads and prayed. But let us be honest, 9 nights could not physically guarantee the safety of all the pilgrimage routes in the region. That would have been a task for several hundred men, not 9. And here the story opens its first dark door. The Temple Mount is not simply a beautiful place with a beautiful name. Beneath it lie literal layers of civilizations: Phoenician, Israelite, Babylonian, Persian, Hellenistic, Roman. And according to Jewish tradition, this is where the first Temple of Solomon stood, built around 1000 BC and destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 BC. It was in this temple, according to the Bible, that the Ark of the Covenant was kept, a wooden chest covered in gold, the vessel of the stone tablets bearing the 10 Commandments, an object of such holiness that, according to Scripture, touching it without permission could kill on the spot, as happened to the Levite Uzzah, who reached out to steady the ark from falling and dropped dead in that very instant. When Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the temple and led the Jewish people into Babylonian captivity, the ark vanished forever. It appears in no Babylonian inventory. It is never mentioned again in the Bible after that moment. Simply silence, as though it had never existed. What if it was not stolen? What if it was hidden? This thought haunted religious scholars for centuries, and now 9 knights were living directly above the very place where, by all calculations, a hidden entrance to the underground tunnels of the first temple might have been found. Living there for 9 years, accepting no new members, not expanding, offering no explanation of what kept them occupied. In 1867, British military engineers Charles Wilson and Charles Warren conducted a systematic survey of the tunnel network beneath the Temple Mount. They found an extensive web of passages cut into the bedrock, and among other things, traces of earlier excavations, niches, shafts, rectangular recesses clearly carved by human hands, and clearly not from the ancient world. In 1894, in those same tunnels, there were discovered spurs, fragments of chainmail, and a wooden beam. In all probability, artifacts from the era of the Crusades. These objects are today held in a museum collection in Scotland. Did the Templars dig beneath the Temple of Solomon? Mainstream scholarship gives no definitive answer. There are no direct written records, but the physical traces exist, and they pose a question that has never been satisfactorily answered. What were they looking for? And did they find it? In 1127, exactly 9 years after the founding of the order, Hugues de Payens abruptly left Jerusalem. He traveled to Europe. He met with Pope Honorius II in Rome, with King Henry I of England, with the King of France, with dozens of influential nobles and church leaders across the continent. And something extraordinary happened. Everyone, absolutely everyone, received him with open arms. Within a matter of months, the order gained hundreds of new volunteer knights, vast donations of land and money, and political support at the highest levels, as though Hugues de Payens had presented something, shown something so compelling, so undeniable, that the rulers of Europe immediately rallied to his cause. What exactly he showed them, history did not record. Among the theories about what the Templars may have brought out of Jerusalem, one has refused to fade for centuries. The Shroud of Turin, a linen cloth more than 4 meters long bearing the image of a man, which no physicist has yet been able to explain. The image is not paint, it is not a drawing. How it came to exist on the fabric remains unknown. The first reliable mention of the shroud in European sources dates to 1357. It surfaced in a small French town called Liray. Its owner, a man named Geoffrey de Charny, a descendant of the Templars, his ancestor of the same name, the last commander of Normandy of the Knights Templar, had been burned alive alongside Grand Master Jacques de Molay in 1314. How the shroud came to be in the possession of this family, Geoffrey de Charny never explained. Not once. Not until his dying day. The connection is speculative. There is no direct proof, but the thread is there. Thin, almost invisible, stretching across the centuries and never quite breaking. It is from exactly such threads that all great mysteries are woven. And while Hugues de Payens was crossing Europe, gathering supporters and patrons, a church council was already being convened in the small French city of Troyes. A council that would decide the fate of his order once and for all. Present at that council was a man without whom the Templars might have remained nothing more than 9 nameless knights in a dusty Jerusalem palace. His name was Bernard of Clairvaux, and he was, by most accounts, the most powerful man in Europe. Though he wore neither crown nor papal tiara. The year is 1128, a small French city called Troyes, in the region of Champagne. January. Cold, grey, damp, the kind of January that makes you feel the sun has simply forgotten this corner of the world exists. The city has filled with church officials, abbots, bishops, secular knights, and courtiers. The agenda is unusual, almost provocative. Can a Christian kill in the name of God? Can a monk carry a sword? Is it permissible to unite prayer and war in a single human being without turning that person into a monster? The church had been wrestling with this question for decades. The Crusades had forced it into the open, but no definitive theological answer existed. And it was precisely to find that answer that they had gathered in Troyes. Present at the council was Bernard of Clairvaux. He was around 38 years old, short, thin, almost painfully pale, the consequence of years of asceticism and monastic fasting. They said he ate so little and slept so little that his body resembled not flesh, but parchment stretched over bone. But when he spoke, kings fell silent. Bernard was the abbot of Clairvaux Monastery, one of the strictest and most influential monasteries in Europe. He had personally founded more than 70 monasteries across the continent. Popes read his letters. His sermons drew thousands of people into open fields. When Bernard of Clairvaux took someone's side, it meant roughly what the simultaneous endorsement of the world's most powerful media organizations would mean today. And he took the side of the Templars. Not merely supported them, he wrote for them a theological justification that overturned centuries of tradition. The treatise was called De Laude Novae Militia, in praise of the new knighthood. And in it Bernard drew a distinction that had never existed before. Killing a man is a sin. That was old truth, known to every Christian. But Bernard proposed a new word, malicidium, the killing of evil. If a warrior kills not a man, but an embodiment of evil, he does not sin. He serves. A Templar who strikes down an enemy of Christ commits not a crime, but a virtue. This was a revolution in Christian thought. Simple, elegant, persuasive, and extraordinarily convenient for those who needed to justify war in the name of faith. The Council of Troyes officially recognized the order. Pope Honorius II approved the rule. The Templars received everything they could have dreamed of: full ecclesiastical blessing, legal status, and the protection of the most influential theologian of the age. Now the order could grow, and it grew, at a speed that, by the standards of the 12th century, bordered on the inexplicable. Within 20 years of the Council of Troyes, the Templars had built a network of commanderies across the whole of Europe: France, England, Portugal, Spain, Italy, Germany. Hundreds of castles, estates, mills, vineyards, harbors. Donations poured in. Noblemen bequeathed their lands to the order on their deathbeds. Young knights joined the brotherhood by the hundreds. The order became the largest landowner in Europe in a time frame that one modern historian described as implausibly short. But the most important thing the Templars created was invisible. It could not be touched or measured in acres of land. They invented the bank, not in the sense of building a building with cashier windows and a sign above the door, in the sense that for the first time in the history of the Western world, they created a system in which money could travel thousands of miles without physically moving at all. Imagine a pilgrim from Burgundy. He has gathered money for his journey to Jerusalem, say 100 livres in gold, carrying it with him across France, over the Alps, through the Italian cities, across the sea, means making himself a target for every bandit along the way. Thousands of pilgrims died precisely this way, not from disease, not from war, but from ordinary robbery. The Templars offered a solution. The pilgrim came to the nearest commandery and deposited his 100 livres. In return, he was given a document, encrypted, bearing a personal seal, with a code known only to him. With this document, he could withdraw an equivalent sum at any other commandery along his route, in Marseille, in Genoa, in Jaffa, in Jerusalem itself. The money remained safe. The pilgrim traveled light. This was the first letter of credit in history, the prototype of the modern bank check. But the Templars did not stop there. They began issuing loans. The first structured loans with interest in medieval Europe, skillfully disguised, of course, to avoid violating the Church's prohibition on usury. They became custodians of valuables. Noble families entrusted them with gold, jewels, important documents. They acted as notaries in major land transactions. They brokered the purchase of entire islands. When King Henry III of England wished to buy the island of Oléron off the French coast in the 13th century, it was the Templars who arranged the deal. Henry paid them £200 per year, and they guaranteed the transfer from the previous owner. When the English crown needed cash, it pledged the crown jewels to the Templars as security. Scepters, crowns, the great seals of state. The most powerful men in Europe were in their debt, in the literal financial sense of the word. The King of France kept the royal treasury in the Paris Temple, the order's headquarters in the capital. In effect, the Templars managed the royal finances of France. They kept the accounts. They monitored the movement of money. They knew exactly how much the king owed and to whom. That knowledge is more dangerous than any sword. And here it is worth pausing, because at precisely this point in the story, history begins to double. And behind the documented facts, something else begins to show through. Something that official chronicles mention only in passing, but which legends speak of in full voice. Across Europe, in those very same decades, Gothic cathedrals were rising one after another. Chartres, Notre Dame, Reims, Amiens, Cologne, Salisbury, Burgos. Each one a masterpiece of engineering thought that, if official architectural history is to be believed, appeared in Europe as if from thin air. Chartres Cathedral is one of the most puzzling examples. The construction of its nave, towers, and famous stained glass windows took approximately 26 years, from 1194 to 1220. 26 years for a structure of such complexity and scale in the 12th century, a pace that modern engineers call remarkable even by contemporary standards, without cranes, without steel reinforcement, without design software. Gothic architecture is a fundamentally different engineering system from anything previously built in Europe. The pointed arch, the ribbed vault, the flying buttress, a system of external supports that absorbs the lateral pressure of the walls and channels it into the ground, bypassing the wall itself. This allows walls to become thin, windows to become enormous, light to fill the interior in a way that no previous Western architectural tradition had ever permitted. Where did this knowledge come from? Architectural historians give a measured answer. Gothic developed gradually from the Romanesque tradition through a series of experiments in the abbey churches of the Ile-de-France. That is an honest answer, but it does not explain one thing: why this transition happened at precisely that moment, at precisely that speed, and in precisely those regions where Templar influence was strongest. The Templars had spent almost 20 years in Jerusalem, at the center of a world that was centuries ahead of Europe in mathematics, geometry, and architecture. Arab scholars had preserved and advanced the legacy of Greek science, while Europe endured its dark ages. Jewish mystics in Jerusalem maintained a tradition of sacred geometry, a conviction stretching back to Pythagoras himself that the universe is built upon numerical proportions accessible only to the initiated. The golden ratio, the proportion in which the relationship of the whole to the larger part equals the relationship of the larger part to the smaller. The number approximately 1.618, which recurs in the proportions of the human body, in the spirals of seashells, in the arrangement of sunflower seeds, and in the proportions of Gothic cathedrals. In Chartres Cathedral, this number appears everywhere, in the ratio of the nave height to its width, in the proportions of the facade, in the spacing of the columns. The French researcher Louis Charpentier, who devoted years of study to Chartres, argued that the building was constructed according to numerical codes encrypted in the texts of Jewish Kabbalah, and that the Templars had received these codes in Jerusalem from guardians of the tradition of whom there was no shortage. Academic scholarship regards this theory with skepticism, but it has not yet managed to definitively disprove it, because the numbers in Chartres genuinely add up, too precisely for coincidence and too beautifully for simple accident. There is one more detail that tourist guidebooks tend to pass over in silence: the labyrinth of Chartres Cathedral. It is laid into the floor of the central nave. Its diameter, 12 meters, 89 centimeters. The distance from the cathedral's entrance doors to the center of the labyrinth, 12 meters, 89 centimeters. A coincidence? An architectural whim? Or a deliberate geometric rhyme, meaningful only to those who know what to look for? In the Middle Ages, pilgrims traversed this labyrinth on their knees, as a symbolic substitute for the journey to Jerusalem. The path inward, the path to the center, the path back. Death and resurrection, lostness and finding. The same themes that alchemical tradition described as the stages of spiritual transformation. Alchemy, a word most people associate with attempts to turn lead into gold. But medieval alchemy was something considerably more complex. It was a philosophical system describing transformation as a universal law of nature. And the Templars, through contact with Arab scholars in Spain, Sicily, and the Holy Land, had access to this tradition. On the portals of several Gothic cathedrals built in regions of strong Templar presence, one can find carvings that fit nowhere within standard Christian iconography. 6 pointed stars, pentagrams, geometric figures identical to those later discovered in the underground chambers of the Paris Temple. The Freemasons of the 18th century claimed that their symbolism and certain rituals derived directly from the Templars. This can be neither proven nor disproven conclusively, but the visual and structural resemblance between Templar and Masonic symbolism is a documented fact that no serious scholar disputes. Stone speaks. You simply need to know its language. By the end of the 12th century, the Knights Templar had become something for which no word existed in 1118. Not merely a military order, not merely a monastic brotherhood, a transnational corporation, to use the modern term, with its own financial system, intelligence network, diplomatic corps, and military machine. Kings needed them, popes valued them, ordinary people feared and admired them in equal measure. But behind all that brilliance and power, inside the order's walls, in closed chapels, in the nighttime chapter meetings, things were happening that the world was not supposed to know about, or so the Templars believed. You swear 3 vows: chastity, poverty, obedience. From this moment you own nothing: your horse, your sword, your clothing, the ring bearing your family crest. Everything passes to the order. Your property, your lands, any money your relatives might bequeath you, all of it now belongs to the Brotherhood. You yourself belong to the Brotherhood. In return, the order gives you everything: shelter, food, weapons, a war horse, considerably finer than the one you arrived on. If you fall ill, you will be treated. If you die in battle, prayers will be said for your soul in perpetuity. If you are captured, the order will pay your ransom. You will never be alone again. You will never be defenseless again. But you will never be free again. The rule of the order, composed by Bernard of Clairvaux and expanded over the following decades, regulated literally every aspect of a Templar's life. It was simultaneously a monastic and a military document, rigid, detailed, leaving no room for personal interpretation. Food. Meat was permitted 3 times a week, no more. On the remaining days, legumes, vegetables, bread, occasionally fish. Overeating was punished with enforced fasting. Discarding food was strictly forbidden. Leftovers were given to the poor or to servants. Clothing. The white mantle with the red cross was for knights only. Sergeants wore brown or black. No ornaments, no furs, no embroidery. The rules specifically mentioned no pointed shoes. This detail seems almost comic until you understand that pointed footwear was a symbol of secular vanity and self-display. A Templar was not supposed to think about his appearance. Sleep. Brothers slept fully dressed in shirt, trousers, and belt. Removing clothing for sleep was forbidden. The light in the dormitory was never extinguished. At least 1 candle burned at all times. The official explanation: to be ready for an alarm at any moment. The unofficial interpretations. We will come to those shortly. Speech. Unnecessary conversation was considered a vice. Laughter was regarded with suspicion. Relations with women were addressed with particular care. A Templar was not to kiss any woman, not his mother, not his sister, not a widow he was helping. The rule stated it without circumlocution. Flee from the kisses of women as you would flee from a poisonous serpent. Remember that phrase. It will return later in an entirely different and considerably darker context. The hierarchy of the order was clear and unshakable. At the summit, the Grand Master, supreme authority in military, administrative, and judicial matters. He was elected for life by a special college of 13 electors, a number chosen deliberately to honor Christ and the 12 apostles. The Grand Master could make most decisions independently, but was required to consult the chapter on matters affecting the order as a whole. Even absolute power had its boundaries. Below him, the marshal. the military commander responsible for combat operations, equipment, and battlefield discipline. Then the commanders of provinces, who governed the order's regional branches. Below them, knights, sergeants, chaplains, brother craftsmen. The structure resembled a modern corporation, with clear division of functions, a vertical chain of command, and one fundamental difference: there were no resignations here. Here one either served until death or left the order in disgrace, which was considered worse than death. Punishments within the order were severe and public. For minor infractions, bread and water, temporary forfeiture of the mantle. For serious violations, demotion to sergeant. For the gravest offenses, fleeing the field without orders, passing information to the enemy, sodomy, immediate and permanent expulsion. An expelled Templar lost everything, including the promise of the order's prayers for his soul after death. By the standards of a medieval man, this was a catastrophe more terrible than physical destruction. But it was in battle that the Templars were truly fearsome. Their combat doctrine rested on two principles: iron discipline and a devastating opening strike. The Templar cavalry charge, a tight wedge of heavy horse moving at full gallop, was one of the most destructive battlefield formations of the age. Horses weighing over 600 kilograms, riders in full armor, lances leveled. The formation held with a precision unattainable by most medieval armies. Retreat without orders was one of the gravest crimes in the rule. A Templar could leave the line in only 3 circumstances: his horse was killed, his commander gave a direct order, or the order's banner had fallen. While the Templar flag still stood, the knight had to stand with it to the end. Muslim commanders held the Templars in particular regard and particular fear. Saladin, the great sultan who unified the Islamic world and challenged the Crusaders, once gave an order that speaks eloquently to the order's reputation. All captured Templars and Hospitallers were to be executed immediately. Not held for ransom, not imprisoned, executed. Because a Templar returned from captivity cost too much. But the year 1187 brought everything to its first great breaking point. The Battle of Hattin, the horned hills above the Sea of Galilee. July, a heat that melted the air and cracked the skin on your lips. Saladin played his hand with surgical precision. He provoked the Crusaders into marching out from their fortified camp, intercepted them in open ground, and, most critically, cut them off from water. For 3 days, the Jerusalem army stood beneath the blazing sun without a single drop to drink. For 3 days, Saladin burned the dry grass around the camp, and smoke blotted out the sky. For 3 days, thirst did its work. On the 4th day, battle, or rather, slaughter. Exhausted, dehydrated, blinded by smoke, the Crusaders could not fight. The army disintegrated. The relic of the true cross, the supreme holy object of the Crusader state, was captured. King Guy of Lusignan himself was taken prisoner, and the Grand Master of the Templars, Gerard de Riedfort, was captured too. Saladin executed every captured Templar and Hospitaller, except one. Gerard de Riedfort was allowed to live. Why? Official history does not explain. Some chroniclers suggested he betrayed several Templar fortresses to Saladin in exchange for his freedom. Others considered this slander. The truth, as usual, remained behind a closed door. Within months of Hattin, Saladin took Jerusalem. The Crusader state for whose defense the Templars existed had collapsed. The order survived, but the purpose of its existence was suddenly in question. How do you protect the Holy Land when the Holy Land is lost? The Templars kept fighting. Acre became their new capital. They fought in the Third Crusade alongside Richard the Lionheart. They held the last coastal fortresses for another 100 years. But something had fractured, not in the armor, but in the idea itself, in the thing that had given the order its meaning. And it was precisely in this period, when the military mission was becoming increasingly spectral while the order's wealth continued to grow, that things began to happen inside the order's walls that were not spoken of openly. Or so the legend says. The Templars' initiation rituals had always been closed to outsiders. This was not unusual. Monastic chapter meetings were universally held without witnesses, but the Templars were closed with a particular density. No minutes, no witnesses, no explanations. Rumors had circulated long before the trial of 1307. People said various things. That by night in their circular chapels something occurred that had no connection to Christian prayer. That new brothers were made to do something shameful upon entering the order. That they possessed an idol, dark, terrible, which they worshipped in secret from the world. At the trial of 1307, these rumors were given names and details. The first accusation, denial of Christ at the moment of initiation. The new brother was allegedly required to spit on the cross 3 times, or to trample it 3 times underfoot. The testimonies differed in detail, but converged in substance. The second, the osculum infame, the shameful kiss. The newly initiated brother allegedly kissed his sponsor on the mouth, at the base of the spine, and below, or in other places. Here the testimonies diverged even further. Some spoke of 1 kiss, others of 3, others of 5. The inconsistencies are a characteristic feature of testimony extracted under torture. When a man does not know exactly what is expected of him, he begins to guess, and each man guesses differently. But the third accusation was the most serious and the most mysterious, the worship of Baphomet. This word appeared in the testimony of several Templars independently of one another, and it is precisely this that prevents it from being dismissed entirely as an invention of the Inquisitors. Something stands behind this word. But what? At the trial, different Templars described Baphomet in completely different terms. One said, a head with 3 faces. Another, a silver head with 2 faces. A third, a wooden figure with a single face. A fourth, a cat. A fifth, simply a luminescence. A sixth swore he had never seen anything of the kind and died on that position. What is Baphomet in reality? This question has occupied historians, theologians, and occultists for 7 centuries, and no definitive answer exists to this day. The simplest version is linguistic. Baphomet is a corrupted pronunciation of the name Mahomet, Muhammad, in Old French. The accusation of secret Islamism was not implausible for men who had spent decades living among Muslims, trading with them, fighting against them, and sometimes concluding alliances with them. Contact with another civilization inevitably leaves traces. The second version is cryptographic. In 1854, the French occultist Eliphas Lévy noted that if you applied to the word Baphomet the method of Atbash, the ancient Hebrew encryption in which each letter of the alphabet is replaced by its corresponding letter from the opposite end. The result is the Latin abbreviation TEMOHPAB, which can be read as Templi Omnium Hominum Pacis Abbas, Father of the Temple of Peace of all men. Atbash is an instrument of Kabbalah, and the Templars, who lived in Jerusalem alongside Jewish scholars, may well have known this instrument. What if Baphomet was not an idol, but a cipher? A coded designation for a theological idea too dangerous to pronounce openly in medieval Europe? The idea that all people, regardless of faith, are children of one God? The third version is alchemical. In the alchemical tradition, the head, caput, was the symbol of the first stage of transformation, the stage of destruction, the death of the old, the clearing of ground for the new. The Templars had access to Arabic alchemical literature through Spain, Sicily, and the Holy Land. Alchemy, in its deepest sense, was a philosophy of transformation, the conversion of the imperfect into the perfect, the mortal into the eternal. It is entirely possible that Baphomet was an internal symbol of the spiritual path, comprehensible only to the initiated, and completely incomprehensible to inquisitors searching for evidence of heresy. The fourth version is the most unsettling. What if, over long decades of life in the East among foreign religions and foreign gods, some Templars had genuinely drifted from Orthodox Christianity? What if, in closed chapels far from ecclesiastical supervision, the order had developed its own spiritual tradition, synthetic, having absorbed elements of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam? This is not as incredible as it sounds. The Crusader state was a remarkable place, a space where three Abrahamic faiths existed side by side, where educated men read Arab philosophy and Jewish mysticism, where the boundary between beliefs was considerably thinner than in Europe. The Templars spent nearly 200 years in that space. 200 years change people. 200 years change entire organizations. Their circular chapels were built not on the model of the Western Basilica, but on the model of the Rotunda of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, the circle, symbol of eternity, of infinity, of cyclical return, beginning and end locked in a single point. In these chapels by night, torches burned, brothers gathered for their chapter meetings, and words were spoken that no outsider ever heard. What happened inside those walls, we do not know. Perhaps nothing beyond ordinary monastic prayers and administrative business. Perhaps something that the Templars themselves carried to their graves. Literally carried to their graves, because the majority of them chose death over confession, and that itself is more eloquent than any words, because ordinary people, broken by torture and the fear of death, confess to anything, to everything. The Templars, however, by the hundreds, chose the fire in silence. They refused to confess even when confession might have saved their lives. What were they protecting with their silence? A secret that did not exist, one they had invented out of fear? Or a secret so real, so significant, that it was worth dying for? History has not yet given us that answer, but it has not forgotten the question. The last years of the 13th century had not been kind to the order. In 1291, the city of Acre fell, the last major Crusader stronghold in the Holy Land. The Templars fought to the very end. The last Grand Master of Acre, Thibaut Gaudin, escaped by sea with the remaining treasury and what was left of the garrison. The city fell on the 18th of May. The Templar commander who stayed behind to cover the retreat, the Marshal Peter de Sèvres, died in the rubble of the collapsed headquarters, surrounded by the bodies of his brothers as the walls came down around him. With Acre gone, the entire justification for the order's existence collapsed. The Templars had been created to protect the Holy Land. The Holy Land was lost. What precisely were they for now? This was not merely a philosophical question, it was a political one. And across Europe, in the courts of kings and the councils of bishops, people were beginning to ask it out loud. The order retreated first to Cyprus, then increasingly back to Europe itself, where its vast network of commanderies continued to generate enormous revenue from lands, mills, vineyards, and financial operations. The Templars remained extraordinarily wealthy, but wealth without a clear military purpose made them a target rather than an asset. Philip IV of France watched all of this with quiet, patient interest. The French crown was in serious financial difficulty. Philip had fought expensive wars against England and Flanders. He had debased the currency twice, and still the debts mounted. And among his largest creditors was the Order of the Knights Templar, who had been financing French royal operations for decades and were owed sums that Philip had no realistic prospect of repaying through ordinary means. There was, however, another way. If the order were to be declared heretical, if its members were arrested, its property seized, its existence legally terminated, the debts would vanish. The lands and treasuries would pass to the French crown, and the most powerful independent financial institution in Europe would cease to exist. It was a plan of breathtaking cynicism, and Philip executed it with the precision of a military campaign. He began laying the groundwork years before the arrests. His primary instrument was a man named William of Nogaret, the king's chief legal advisor, and by any honest assessment, one of the most ruthlessly effective political operators of the medieval period. It was Nogaret who had previously engineered the humiliation of Pope Boniface VIII, physically assaulting the elderly pope at Anagni in 1303 in a confrontation so shocking that Boniface died within weeks. Some said of the shame of it. If Nogaret could do that to a pope, a military order presented no particular moral obstacle. Working through informers and disgruntled former Templars, men who had been expelled from the order and harbored grievances, Nogaret assembled a dossier of accusations: denial of Christ at initiation, obscene kisses, idol worship, sodomy, corruption of the sacraments. Every charge was designed to shock, to horrify, to make the arrest of the entire order seem not merely justified, but urgently necessary in the eyes of the church and the public. In 1305, Philip secured a crucial advantage. The previous pope, Boniface VIII, the man Nogaret had helped destroy, was replaced after a brief interregnum by a new pontiff, Clement V, a Frenchman, a man who owed his elevation to the papacy in no small part to Philip's political support, a man who would prove, in the years to come, entirely unable to resist the French king's pressure. Clement V moved the papal court from Rome to Avignon, effectively relocating the headquarters of the Catholic Church to French soil, where it would remain for the next 70 years. The independence of the papacy from French royal influence, carefully maintained for centuries, evaporated almost overnight. Philip now had everything he needed: a compliant pope, a comprehensive list of charges, a legal framework, and the element of complete surprise. He would need that surprise. The Templars were not naive. They had survived 2 centuries of the most dangerous political environment in the medieval world. They had sources of information in every royal court in Europe. Any warning, any hint that something was coming, and the Order's leadership would have time to move assets, send word to the fleet, perhaps even appeal directly to other monarchs for protection. Philip gave them no warning at all. The sealed orders went out in late September 1307. Thousands of them, carried by royal messengers to every corner of France. Each envelope bore the king's seal and a single instruction on the outside. Do not open until the morning of Friday, the 13th of October. Think about the scale of that operation for a moment. Coordinating the simultaneous arrest of an organization with commanderies across the entire country in an age without telegraph, without telephone, without any means of instant communication, required months of secret planning and a level of operational security that would be impressive by modern standards. Every sheriff, every royal officer, every soldier involved had to be briefed, deployed, and held in position without a single word leaking to the Templars. Not one word leaked. In the pre-dawn darkness of Friday the 13th of October, 1307, royal officers across France broke the seals on their orders and read the same words simultaneously. They were to arrest every Templar in France immediately, seize all Templar properties and assets in the king's name, and hold the prisoners for interrogation by the Inquisition. At dawn, the doors came down. In Paris, in Lyon, in Bordeaux, in Rouen, in dozens of cities and towns across the country, armed men surrounded Templar commanderies and demanded immediate surrender. Most Templars were taken completely by surprise, asleep in their beds, at morning prayer, at breakfast. They had no warning, no time to organize resistance, no opportunity to destroy documents or move valuables. In a single morning, Philip IV arrested approximately 2,000 Templars on French soil. Among them was the Grand Master himself. Jacques de Molay was in his early 60s in the autumn of 1307. He had led the order for 18 years, a period defined almost entirely by the aftermath of the fall of Acre, by the desperate attempts to organize a new crusade that never materialized, and by the increasingly hostile political environment that he had sensed, but perhaps not fully understood until it was too late. He was in Paris when the arrests came. He had been there at Philip's personal invitation, a guest of the French crown attending the funeral of the king's sister-in-law. He had walked beside the king in the funeral procession just days before his arrest, carrying the pall over the coffin. He had dined at the royal table. And then, before dawn on Friday the 13th, the soldiers came. De Molay was taken to the temple, the great Templar fortress in the heart of Paris, which was simultaneously being seized and inventoried by royal officers. Everything was recorded: the treasury, the archives, the contents of every room. Philip's men were thorough and methodical. They had been planning this for a long time. What they did not find was the fleet. The Templar fleet that had been anchored in the harbor of La Rochelle on the evening of the 12th of October, 18 warships, fully provisioned, loaded with what the Templar port records described only as the contents of the Paris treasury, had vanished by the time the royal officers arrived the following morning. The harbor was empty. The ships were gone. No one could explain where they had gone or who had ordered them to sail, or what they were carrying. 18 ships, gone without a trace. To this day, no one knows where they went. The most persistent theory, and it is only a theory, let that be clearly understood, is that someone inside the order received advance warning and organized an emergency evacuation of the most important assets. The financial records that could have documented the full extent of royal debt to the order. The sacred objects, if any existed. The archives of 2 centuries of correspondence with kings, popes, and emperors. Some researchers point to Scotland. At the time of the arrests, Scotland was under a papal interdict following its conflict with England, which meant in practical terms that papal authority did not formally apply there, and the charges of heresy levelled at the Templars by the Pope had no legal standing on Scottish soil. A Templar fleet arriving in Scottish waters could not be lawfully arrested. Others point to Portugal, where the order was never dissolved, but simply renamed, becoming the Order of Christ, which continued to operate openly and eventually financed the great Portuguese voyages of exploration in the 15th century. Vasco da Gama sailed to India under a flag bearing the Red Cross of the Templars. The treasure of the Knights Templar has never been found. Not by Philip IV, despite his most thorough efforts. Not by anyone since. What followed the arrests was a spectacle that contemporary observers found deeply disturbing, even those who had no particular sympathy for the order. The interrogations began immediately. The Inquisition, under the direction of William of Paris, the king's own confessor, who held the position of Grand Inquisitor of France, applied its standard methods with systematic efficiency. Sleep deprivation, starvation, the strappado, suspension by the wrists tied behind the back, a technique that dislocated the shoulders without leaving immediately visible marks, and, in the more serious cases, the direct application of flame to the soles of the feet. Under these conditions, men confessed. Many Templars, including, devastatingly, Jacques de Molay himself, signed confessions admitting to the denial of Christ, the obscene rituals, and the worship of idols. The confessions were read publicly. They were copied and distributed across Europe. Philip IV had what he needed, a documented record of heresy that justified everything that had followed. But then something unexpected happened. The Templars began to recant. One by one, then in groups, the imprisoned knights withdrew their confessions. They had confessed under torture, they said. The confessions were false. They had said whatever their interrogators wanted to hear in order to make the pain stop. The real truth was that none of it had ever happened. Not the denial of Christ, not the idol, not the shameful rituals. It was all fabricated, all of it. Recanting a confession of heresy in medieval law carried an automatic death sentence. A heretic who confessed and then withdrew his confession was considered a relapsed heretic, and relapsed heretics burned. Philip IV counted on this. 54 Templars who recanted their confessions were burned alive in a field outside Paris in May 1310. Not one by one, all 54 together on a single day, in a mass execution designed to break the resistance of those who remained. Contemporary accounts describe it as one of the most horrifying things anyone present had ever witnessed. And yet, even after that day, the recantations continued. The order was formally dissolved by Pope Clement V at the Council of Vienne in 1312. Not condemned as heretical, the evidence was too contradictory, the confessions too obviously coerced, but simply suppressed, erased. Its properties were theoretically transferred to the Knights Hospitaller, though in practice Philip IV kept most of what was on French soil. Jacques de Molay spent the next 7 years in prison, repeatedly pressured to confirm his confession, repeatedly refusing to do so in any definitive way. He was old, he was ill. He had confessed once under torture, and the shame of that confession haunted him through every day of his imprisonment. In March 1314, 7 years after the arrests, the authorities decided to end it, the 18th of March, 1314. A platform had been erected on the Ile de Javiot, a small island in the Seine, in the shadow of Notre Dame Cathedral. The setting was deliberate, public, visible from the riverbanks on both sides, a final demonstration of royal and papal authority over the broken remnants of the most powerful military order in Christian history. Jacques de Molay was brought out along with Geoffrey de Charnay, the commander of Normandy, to hear their sentences read publicly. The expectation was that they would confirm their confessions one final time, accepting their punishment with the broken submission of men who had nothing left to fight for. De Molay had other ideas. Standing on the platform in front of the assembled crowd, in front of the royal representatives and the church officials, with Notre Dame rising behind him across the water, the 70-year-old Grand Master of the Knights Templar raised his voice and spoke. He withdrew every confession he had ever made. He declared that the order of the Knights Templar was pure and holy, that the charges against it were entirely false, that the confessions had been extracted through torture and were worthless as evidence of anything except the cruelty of those who extracted them. He declared that the true crimes of this day were being committed not by the Templars, but by those who had destroyed them. The crowd went silent. The royal and church officials had no immediate answer for this. The execution had been planned as a confirmation, not a defiance. De Molay's sudden reversal threw the entire carefully staged proceeding into chaos. Philip's representatives made a rapid decision. The sentence was changed on the spot from life imprisonment to death by fire. The pyre was prepared on the island that same afternoon. Jacques de Molay and Geoffrey de Charnay were burned alive as the sun went down over Paris. Contemporary accounts agree that de Molay died with extraordinary composure. He asked to be tied facing Notre Dame so that he could pray toward the cathedral until the end. This request was granted, and as the fire took hold, he spoke words that witnesses recorded with remarkable consistency across multiple independent sources. He summoned Pope Clement V to appear before God's judgment within 40 days. He summoned Philip IV of France to appear before the same judgment before the year was out. Pope Clement V died 33 days later, of a sudden illness, the nature of which his physicians could not fully explain. Philip IV of France died in November of the same year, 1314. He was 46 years old and had been in apparently good health. He suffered a stroke while hunting, collapsed, and never regained consciousness. History records these as coincidences, and perhaps they were. But the people of Paris, who had watched an old man burn on a river island and heard his final words carry across the water, drew their own conclusions. and those conclusions passed from generation to generation, growing in the telling, accumulating weight and darkness with each century that passed. The curse of Jacques de Molay became one of the most enduring legends in European history. Whether you believe it or not depends on what you think about the relationship between human will and the indifferent machinery of fate. Whether a dying man's words can reach into the world and pull two powerful men after him into the dark. History cannot answer that question, but it recorded the dates very precisely, and the dates do not lie. Not every European kingdom dissolved the Templar Order in 1312. The papal bull Vox in Excelso, issued by Clement V at the Council of Vienne, formally suppressed the order. But suppression and dissolution are different things, and different monarchs interpreted their obligations differently. In Portugal, the situation was particularly striking. King Denis I of Portugal had long maintained that the charges against the Templars were fabricated, a view shared privately by a significant number of European monarchs who were not indebted to the French crown and therefore had no financial incentive to pretend otherwise. Denis refused to condemn the Portuguese Templars as heretics. He negotiated directly with the papacy, and in 1319, just 5 years after the burning of Jacques de Molay, he received papal approval for the creation of a new order on Portuguese soil, the Order of Christ. It was, by any honest assessment, the Knights Templar, with a different name. The same members, the same properties, the same organizational structure, the same rule modified slightly, the same red cross on a white background, though the precise design was altered enough to satisfy the legal requirement of institutional discontinuity. The Order of Christ became one of the wealthiest and most powerful organizations in Portugal. Its headquarters were established at Tomar, the great Templar castle and convent that still stands today, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, its round Templar chapel at its center, unchanged since the 12th century. If you stand inside that chapel today, in the circular space that the Templars built and the Order of Christ inherited, you are standing in a direct physical line of continuity from 1118 to the present moment. But the Order of Christ's most remarkable contribution to history came in the 15th century, when Portugal launched the Great Age of Exploration. Prince Henry the Navigator, Infante Dom Enrique, governor of the Order of Christ from 1420, used the order's vast financial resources to fund the systematic exploration of the African coastline, the Atlantic islands, and eventually the sea routes to India and the Americas. The ships that carried Portuguese explorers into unknown waters sailed under a flag bearing the Red Cross of the Order of Christ, the same cross that Templar knights had worn on their white mantles 2 centuries before. Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope and reached India in 1498 under that cross. Pedro Álvares Cabral reached Brazil in 1500 under that cross. The cross of the Knights Templar planted itself on the shores of continents that Hugues de Payens could never have imagined existing. The Templars did not discover the New World, but the institution they created, wearing the institutional clothing of a successor order, provided the financial and organizational infrastructure that made the Age of Discovery possible. That is not a legend. That is history. Scotland is a different story. And here the line between documented fact and compelling legend becomes considerably harder to draw. When the arrests came in October 1307, the papal authority that gave Philip IV's campaign its legal force did not apply in Scotland. The country was under a papal interdict, effectively excommunicated as a political entity due to the ongoing wars of Scottish independence against England. In practical terms, this meant that the Pope's orders regarding the Templars carried no legal weight on Scottish soil. A number of Templars unquestionably fled to Scotland in the months following the arrests. This is documented. What is less clear is how many, who they were, and what, if anything, they brought with them. The most dramatic version of the Scottish Templar story centers on the Battle of Bannockburn in June 1314, fought just 3 months after the burning of Jacques de Molay. Robert the Bruce, King of Scotland, faced the English army of Edward II at Bannockburn with a force significantly smaller than his opponents. By the conventional military calculus of the time, the English should have won. They did not. The Scottish victory at Bannockburn was so decisive, so unexpected in its completeness, that contemporaries struggled to explain it in purely military terms. And so, the legend grew. According to the tradition that developed over the following centuries, a group of Templar knights, refugees from the French persecution, men with nothing left to lose and nowhere left to go, appeared at the critical moment of the battle and charged the English flank, turning the tide of a fight that had been going badly for the Scots. Men who had sworn to die before they would submit to unjust authority, fighting one last time in a cause not entirely their own. Is this true? Mainstream historians regard it with considerable skepticism. There are no contemporary accounts that mention Templars at Bannockburn. The story appears in Scottish sources only significantly later and carries the characteristic marks of legend: the dramatic timing, the mysterious strangers, the perfectly placed intervention. But this much is certain. After Bannockburn, Robert the Bruce was accused by the papacy of harboring Templar fugitives. The accusation was not denied with particular vehemence. And in the decades that followed, certain families in Scotland, families with names that appear in Templar records, rose to positions of remarkable prominence and influence. Among them, the St. Clair family of Rosslyn. Rosslyn Chapel sits in a shallow valley south of Edinburgh, completed in 1486 by William St. Clair, the first Earl of Orkney. It is, by any architectural standard, one of the most extraordinary buildings in the British Isles. A small chapel so extravagantly carved, so densely covered in stone imagery, so structurally unusual that it has attracted the fascinated attention of researchers, mystics, and conspiracy theorists in roughly equal measure for 5 centuries. The carvings inside Rosslyn Chapel are the detail that stops every serious visitor cold. Among the hundreds of carved stone figures and symbols that cover every surface of the interior, there are images that have no obvious explanation within conventional Christian iconography. Green men, the foliate faces of pre-Christian vegetation gods, appear throughout the stonework, some in positions that suggest deliberate prominence rather than incidental decoration. There are geometric patterns that recur in Islamic architecture. There are carvings of plants that, according to some botanical researchers, depict species native to the Americas, species that, according to the accepted historical timeline, a Scottish stonemason working in 1486 should have had no knowledge of whatsoever. Columbus reached the Americas in 1492. Rosslyn Chapel was under construction before that date. How does a carving of an American plant species appear on the walls of a Scottish chapel built before the official European discovery of America? The mainstream explanation, that the plants are actually European species misidentified by later observers, is possible, but not entirely satisfying. The alternative explanations range from the intriguing to the genuinely extraordinary. One school of thought connects this directly to the Templar fleet that vanished from La Rochelle in October 1307. 18 ships, experienced navigators with knowledge of Atlantic currents gathered from 2 centuries of maritime operations between Europe and the Holy Land. A desperate need to find somewhere beyond the reach of the French king and the compliant Pope. The North Atlantic was not entirely unknown territory. Norse explorers had reached the eastern shores of North America several centuries earlier, and those Norse charts and oral traditions were available to people with the right connections. Did the Templar fleet reach North America in 1307, almost 2 centuries before Columbus? There is no direct proof, but there are a number of archaeological anomalies on the eastern seaboard of North America that have been tentatively linked by some researchers to pre-Columbian European presence. The Newport Tower in Rhode Island, a circular stone structure whose origins remain genuinely contested among archaeologists. Certain carved stones in New England bearing markings that some researchers read as medieval script. The evidence is fragmentary, disputed, and far from conclusive. But the question it raises is one that serious historians acknowledge cannot yet be definitively answered. Where did the fleet go? Back in Europe, the Templar legacy was taking a different form. Less dramatic, perhaps, but ultimately more influential on the shape of the modern world. The suppression of the order did not suppress the ideas associated with it. The tradition of secret brotherhood, of initiatic ritual, of esoteric knowledge passed between members through symbolic ceremony. These ideas did not die with the order. They went underground, persisting in the networks of merchant guilds, stonemasons' fraternities, and mystical brotherhoods that continued to operate throughout the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries, mostly beneath the radar of ecclesiastical authority. The stonemasons are particularly significant. The great Gothic cathedrals that were still being built and extended throughout this period required enormous technical skill that was jealously guarded within the craft guilds and transmitted through apprenticeship and initiation. The builders who worked on these structures formed closed brotherhoods with their own signs of recognition, their own symbolic language, their own rituals of initiation and advancement. Sound familiar? In 1717, 4 centuries after the dissolution of the Templar Order, 4 London lodges came together to form the premier Grand Lodge of England. Modern Freemasonry, in its organized institutional form, was born. And from the very beginning, the question of its relationship to the Knights Templar was one that its members could not quite leave alone. The 18th degree of Scottish Rite Freemasonry is called the Knight Rose Croix. The 30th degree is called the Knight Kadosh, a title derived from the Hebrew word for holy, but used within the degree's ritual in explicit connection with the memory of Jacques de Molay and the injustice of the Templar persecution. The 33rd and highest degree of Scottish Rite Masonry contains ritual elements that several serious researchers of Masonic history have traced through documented lines of transmission to practices recorded in the commanderies of the medieval Templars. Mainstream Masonic historians are cautious about these claims, and rightly so, because the documentary evidence for a direct, unbroken institutional connection between the medieval Templars and 18th century Freemasonry does not exist. There is no document, no charter, no membership list that bridges the gap, but the symbolic evidence is harder to dismiss. The language, the geometry, the ritual structure, the emphasis on the rebuilding of Solomon's temple as a central metaphor. These are not coincidences that can be explained away by pointing at other sources. Something passed between the world of the Templars and the world of the Freemasons. What exactly it was, and through what channels, remains one of the genuinely open questions of European cultural history. In the 19th century, something remarkable happened to the Templar legacy. It exploded. The Romantic movement, with its passion for the medieval, the mysterious, and the occult, discovered the Knights Templar and fell deeply in love. Writers, poets, painters, composers, and philosophers seized on the order as the perfect vehicle for everything that the dry rationalism of the Enlightenment had failed to provide: drama, mystery, secret knowledge, sacred architecture, martyrdom, the sense that behind the mundane surface of the world there lay a hidden layer of meaning accessible only to the initiated. Sir Walter Scott wrote about the Templars in Ivanhoe, giving millions of readers their first vivid encounter with the order's imagery. The German Romantics connected the Templars to the legend of the Holy Grail, arguing elaborately and passionately that the Grail romances of the medieval period were in fact coded accounts of Templar knowledge. Richard Wagner's Parsifal, premiered in 1882, drew heavily on this tradition, presenting the Grail Knights as thinly veiled Templars, guarding a sacred mystery at the heart of the world. The 19th century also saw the birth of the modern conspiracy theory in its fully developed form, and the Templars were central to almost every major example. The French writer Léo Taxil fabricated an entire mythology of satanic Masonic Templarism in the 1880s that was exposed as a hoax but continued to circulate in degraded form for decades. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, one of the most destructive conspiracy documents in history, borrowed structural elements from the Templar mythology while redirecting its anti-establishment paranoia in a catastrophically different direction. The 20th century added new dimensions. The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, published in 1982 by Michael Begant, Richard Lee, and Henry Lincoln, proposed that the Templars had discovered evidence of the bloodline of Christ, that Jesus had married Mary Magdalene, that their descendants had founded a royal dynasty in France, and that the Templars had been the guardians of this secret for centuries. The book was a sensation. It was also, by the assessment of every serious historian who examined it, a work of creative fiction presented as historical research, but it planted a seed that Dan Brown harvested 20 years later with the Da Vinci Code, a novel that sold 80 million copies worldwide and introduce the Templar mythology to a global audience that had never previously encountered it. Whatever one thinks of the novel's historical accuracy, and historians think very little of it, its cultural impact was undeniable. The Knights Templar entered the 21st century more famous, more mythologized, and more culturally present than at any point since their actual existence. And yet, beneath all the mythology, beneath the novels and the films, and the conspiracy theories and the Masonic rituals and the New Age appropriations, the real Knights Templar continue to be genuinely fascinating. More fascinating, in many ways, than any of the legends built upon them. Because the real story is this: 9 men in a dusty city made a decision in 1118 that through a combination of military skill, financial innovation, political acumen, theological patronage, and, yes, a great deal of strategic secrecy, built an institution that accumulated more power, wealth, and influence than almost anything comparable in the medieval world. And then that institution was destroyed, not by military defeat, not by theological failure, not by any internal collapse, but by a single king's decision that its power had grown too great to be tolerated. That story does not need embellishment. It does not need the Holy Grail or the Ark of the Covenant or the bloodline of Christ to be extraordinary. It is extraordinary on its own terms. But here is the thing about great mysteries. They attract additions. They attract interpretation. They attract the weight of every age's anxieties and hopes projected onto the open questions that the evidence leaves behind. The Templars left behind a great many open questions, and those questions have been accumulating projections for 7 centuries. The 18 ships are still missing. The archives are still lost. The treasure has never been found. And in Rosslyn Chapel, if you look carefully at the carved stonework near the east wall, there is a figure that no one has ever satisfactorily explained. A carved face, partly concealed by surrounding foliage, whose expression, caught in stone for 5 centuries, seems to be on the precise boundary between a smile and a warning, as though the stone itself knows something, as though it has always known, and is waiting with the particular patience of stone for someone to finally ask the right question. Tonight you have heard the beginning of one of the longest, strangest, and most consequential stories in the history of the Western world. 9 nights in Jerusalem, 2 centuries of power, a Friday morning in October, a fire on a river island, and then silence, followed by everything that came after. The story of the Knights Templar is not finished. It will not be finished until the ships are found, the archives recovered, the questions answered. And since none of those things appears likely to happen soon, the story remains, as it has always remained, beautifully, infuriatingly, magnificently open. Rest now. The mystery is not going anywhere. It has been waiting for 700 years. It will still be here tomorrow night.
you.